Back at it again. And, while a lot of Americans struggle with, different costs because of inflation and certain things, we had something going on at the White House that I think is very important to talk about. But before we hop into it, like, share, comment, hit that subscribe button if you're new. Make sure you're following me on social media too. All of those links are down below. And with that being said, let's dive into this craziness.
Of the day, obviously, Vladimir Zelensky visited Washington, D.C. yesterday. He spoke before a joint session of Congress last night. This is his first trip outside of the country since the beginning of the Ukraine war that Russia launched in February of 2022, a lot earlier this year. The war has been going on for at least 10 months at this point. It has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. One of the big questions that has arisen, particularly on the right, but also for some people on the left, is why the United States is involved in this in the first place. And the answer is actually multifaceted because foreign policy is a complicated area. So the answer is actually not all that complicated. Russia is a geopolitical foe of the United States. Degrading Russia is in the strategic interest of the United States. Now, there are some people on the right who are very isolationist in orientation, and they're constantly asking why the United States should basically be involved anywhere in the world, which was a fair question in about 1850. It is a less fair question today when obviously global supply chains have to do with international politics, when global economics have to do with international politics, when the ability to move weaponry and troops and terrorists around the globe is very, very easy. We live in a very global society. What that means is that the waters that once protected the United States from all encroachments abroad, those waters look a lot narrower than they did circa about 1850. And what that means, that geopolitically, our foes are either on the move or they are in retreat. The United States is either on the move or it is in retreat. The world is a safer place when the U.S. has more hegemony. The world is a less safe place when the U.S. tends to create a vacuum in foreign policy, which is then filled by geopolitical foes like Russia or like China. What this means on a sort of hard nose level is that we do have an interest in degrading Russia's military strength to invade surrounding countries. We have that interest because Russia, again, is a geopolitical foe of the United States that is not interested in forming an alliance with the United States. That has been our foe in Syria. It's been our foe in Afghanistan. It's been our foe repeatedly throughout the world that is hoping to shape a new sphere of influence to activate against the West. Russia is not a part of the West. Russia's been given every opportunity, particularly in the fall of the Soviet Union, to do that. Russia just has not taken advantage of any of that. Russia's goal has been pretty overtly to break NATO. NATO, in the aftermath of the Cold War, was reconstituted as a sort of anti-Russian alliance, knowing that Russia had predatory instincts with regard to the Baltic states particularly, but also with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Poland, with regard to a lot of the former satellites of the Soviet Union. NATO continued to be a viable defense mechanism against the Russians. That doesn't mean that NATO's policy with Ukraine has made any sense. It hasn't made any sense. NATO, which originally was formed with a tripartite purpose, keep the Americans in, keep the Germans down, keep the Russians out, right? That was the tripartite purpose. That continues to be NATO's mission, is to keep Germany at the center of European politics without allowing them to sort of break out, because they've done so twice in the 20th century to the devastation of the world. To keep the Americans in, because America has an interest in European politics, at least to the extent that we send the money. And to keep the Russians out, because, again, Russia's predatory instincts were communist, and now they are more oligarchic. So that mission maintains, but that does not mean that NATO wasn't playing games with Ukraine. They kept making overtures to Ukraine. Maybe you should come, maybe you should not come. And finally, Russia got tired of it and invaded. And you see why Putin invaded. Doesn't mean it was justified, but you see why he did it. He also had the bizarre notion that Ukraine was not, at this point, a polity of its own, that it considered itself part of Russia, so he'd be able to walk in just the way that Hitler walked into Austria during the Anschluss, and everybody just cheered. Putin obviously thought that was going to happen in Ukraine. That did not happen. Part of the reason, by the way, it didn't happen is because Russia had invaded the Donetsk-Luhansk region as well as Crimea in 2014 and turned those places into absolute hellholes. So if you're a Ukrainian looking to your east and you look at Luhansk, Donetsk, or looking to your south at Crimea, and you say, I can be living like those people or I could be living not like those people, the answer is you don't want to live under Russian rule. It turns out that Vladimir Putin's rule has not been good for Russians, and it has not been for Ukrainians inside Luhansk, Donetsk, or inside Crimea. So that miscalculation by Putin has led to an entrenched war in which he has been pretty thoroughly rebutted. In the surprise of the war is not only that Ukraine was able to stave off Russia, but the Ukraine has been able to inflict extraordinary casualties on Russia. Now, part of that is because Russia's conventional military is actually incredibly second-rate. Not just their trained soldiers, but also their weaponry. Their weaponry is really old because Russia is a very poor country. I mean, it really is. Russia's GDP total is about the GDP of the state of Florida. Russia is not a rich country.
Holy moly. Is that true? I mean, listen, I've been sitting here silent this entire time because I've just been learning so much new information. You know, when you don't know anything, you shut up and you listen. That's why you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So I've just been sitting back and listening, but holy, the same amount as Florida? 1 state out of 50? Sheesh. And it also, you know, this whole situation is really surprising because, you know, growing up, I always thought, you know, Russia was just like this big, powerful, dominant force. You know, they were one of the only forces that could compete with the likes of us, the U.S. Now, obviously, they got some huge missiles that they could use that, you know, outnumber ours. But it's in terms of everything else, you know, I thought that they were just this overpowering force. Now, granted, we have been sending money and equipment, so it's kind of not just fighting Ukraine, you know what I mean? So I get that, but still at the same time, you know, I always thought, and this was just my ignorance, possibly, Russia was just this dominant force. Same thing with China. They're both like these. You don't want to see a battle with those two countries in particular. Now, we would win in the end, but, you know, minus the nukes and stuff like that, just everything else, it's going to be hell. Now, it hasn't turned out quite that way. Now, obviously, the loss of life is always tragic, and that's never something you want to see. But if you would have asked me about this, you know, when I was a kid, oh yeah, Russia's about to blow straight through them. What? What? You serious? You know, but yeah, to watch this all play out is shocking.
Russia is, as some people have suggested, an oil station with a nuclear arsenal. And because of that, Russia's conventional military was defeated by Ukraine, which was armed with NATO weaponry, which actually is significantly upgraded weaponry over whatever the Russians have to offer. So Russia has been forced back. That is in the interest of the United States. It upholds the deterrent power of NATO. It degrades Russia's conventional military to the extent that Russia is going to have a very tough time with adventurous ambitions in terms of foreign policy and violating other countries' borders, which is good for the world. Stability is generally a good thing. Violation of borders is generally a bad thing. And it deters China as well, because again, the cost that Russia has now borne is so significant that if China is looking at Taiwan and thinking to itself, maybe we will try that, well, looking at what happened to Russia, not wonderful if you're China. Now, China's gotten some side benefits, like namely, it's been able to turn Russia into its giant oil field. Russia's been shipping all of its oil to China. Instead of China once being a client state of the Soviet Union, now Russia is essentially a client state of China. So in some ways, it's maximized Chinese powers, but in other ways, it's actually degraded a very strong strategic ally of the Chinese and made it harder for them to engage in adventurous foreign policy in Taiwan. So the United States has achieved a bunch of interests with regard to the Ukraine war. And as far as the investment that the United States has made in the Ukraine war, again, we've expended no lives in the Ukraine war. We've expended a fair bit of money in the Ukraine war. But the truth is that the amount of money that we have spent in 2022 amounts to approximately 6% of total U.S. defense spending. In 2022, the U.S. defense budget was $715 billion. The amount that we've spent in Ukraine is something like $77 billion. It'll raise to maybe $100 billion. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But it represents a fraction of the United States' military budget.
Still, that's a lot of money, son. It's a lot of money. There's a lot of veterans out here who could use those dollars. And I'm not saying take away money from, you know, our military. I don't believe in that. But there are some other places that we could pull money from, like in the spending bill, the omnibus spending bill that they're passing right now, unfortunately. And we need to still make sure our voices are heard on that peacefully, of course. There was a portion of it that was going towards Michelle Obama's like walking trail or something, a walking trail named after Michelle Obama or something. It was like some millions of dollars being like, why couldn't that go towards, you know, homeless veterans here in America? Huh? We're sending some millions of dollars over to like Pakistan, I believe, for equality something. Why couldn't that go to homeless veterans or just veterans in general here in America? I'd be in support of that. I'd rather those millions of dollars go to people who fought for my freedom and your freedom, than to go overseas. I'd rather it stay right here on American soil. But of course, this administration doesn't care about the men and women of our military. They only care when, there's a battle to be fought. So if you're a military veteran, talk to me. How do you and your buddies feel about this whole situation? How do you think it's going to play out? Do you think people are going to eventually say, no, we're not fighting for you? You don't care about us. You don't take care of us. Do you think it would ever go that far? Let me know. It's just a question. I'm honestly curious. Talk to me.
If you could trade, say, 10% of the American military budget for the complete degradation of the Russian military, that actually is not a bad move, considering that the Ukrainian armed forces have already killed or wounded at least 100,000 Russian troops. That is half of its original fighting force. There have been almost 8,000 confirmed losses of armored vehicles, including thousands of tanks, thousands of APCs, artillery pieces, hundreds of fixed and rotary wing aircraft, numerous naval vessels. So basically, we've destroyed half of the Russian military by just giving the weapons to Ukraine. So that is a pretty solid return. I mean, the truth is that on a year-to-year level, the amount of money that we'd be spending in the American military budget in order to counter whatever moves the Russians are making would easily be that amount of money. And here you're talking about a one-time expenditure that has taken out an extraordinary percentage of the Russian military. So is it in America's interest to fund this? Sure. Now the question becomes what the end of this war looks like. And this has been my point. The United States and Ukraine had convergent interests when it came to the beginning of this war. Stop the Russians, push the Russians back, degrade the Russian military. Now the question becomes, for how long? What is the end point here? Because the truth is that the United States does have an interest in stability. Despite all of the talk about how we would love to see regime change in Russia, the truth is we don't know what comes next in Russia. And were the Russian regime to fall, what you could end up with, as Henry Kissinger has said, is a complete destruction of any centralized authority in Russia. And now you're talking about an extraordinarily large landmass with tribal situations taking over all over this landmass, armed with 2,500 nuclear weapons. That does not sound like an ideal situation. You actually do need a centralized government in Russia, as much as you think that Vladimir Putin is a thug and a strongman. As much as that is true, the complete collapse of the Russian government into sort of chaos would be a worse solution probably than what we are currently looking at right now.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, guys.
And, not only that, but I've got another clip that I want to show you guys. Check this out.
Tucker Carlson had a rather quick snippet that I thought was pretty solid on this.
As far as we know, no one's ever addressed the United States Congress in a sweatshirt before, but they love him much more than they love you.
Like, that's just true. These people who are giving your money to this guy, who are giving him standing ovations, they do love him more than they love you. That's unfortunate. And by the way, that's bipartisan.
So my question to you all is, how do you feel about it? From talking to, different folks, my take is that most Americans would disagree with what they are doing. Most Americans would not be doing this same thing. But I'll pose the question to you guys. Do you agree with this amount of spending, continuously sending money over there? I think Ben Shapiro said we're almost at 80 billion. I think they're trying to get another 40 billion. Well, I don't know if that was part of the 80 already. I don't believe that 40 was added up into the 80 quite yet. So I think it's an additional 44 or something billion on top of the almost 80. If it was simply up to the American people, not politicians, if it was all of us casting a vote, yay or nay, what do you say? Ooh, and that rhymed. But seriously, what would you say? Would you say no? Or would you say, yeah, let's send them the money. Let's send them the equipment they need. We need to push the Russians back. It's in our interest. We need to destroy them. Let me know. And let me know why or why not. Talk to me. I just thought it was interesting to see him, in front of all of the American politicians, and Nancy Pelosi and Kamala held up the Ukrainian flag behind them. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that one. But what do y'all think? Let me know in the comment section below. Like, share, comment. Hit that subscribe button before you go. Peace and love. I'm out.